Several weeks ago, the Dodgers' new star Mookie Betts moved into a house on our block. 28 years old and owner of the third richest contract in the history of North American sports. On the other hand, George Floyd, trying to pass off a fake $20 bill, is dead. What kind of story is this? Just a modern version of the haves and have-nots? How did Mookie end up rich, and what kind of desperate neighborhoods grow George Floyd's, who went to prison 8 times before he died? Well, this speech does not propose to answer. It does propose to simply list some of the events that have happened during my lifetime and see if where we are today is where we were when I was a kid. There were no Mookie Betts in our New Jersey cul-de-sac. There were no riots either. One of the tenets of speech-making is working from what you know. The danger is that the speech will tend to sound like a personal history, but connecting the dots on one's own experiences in a world that continues to amaze is still a valid history. Floyd's death stirred up yet another Black Lives Matter movement. But can you put that label on this chaos? It's been like a jailbreak out of an insane asylum. Vigilantes, Antifas, exhibitionists, Match.com rejects, white supremacists, black victims, looters, cops, federal troops, rubber bullets, tear gas, beanbags. Some of you guys might have a concept of what was going on, but I don't. I just see it as a bunch of kindergartners being let out at recess, overdosing on Ritalin. I've never been an activist, don't have the balls or the brains. Never carried a sign in a demonstration, even when my fraternity brothers were dying in Nam. When anything controversial happened, I stopped reading the paper and stayed in my room until the shouting died down. Since cowardice is a big part of my character, I decided to trace the Peachin DNA and see if there were any of my relatives with even the slightest hint of a backbone. And in so doing, I constructed a rather winding narrative, which may lead us back to the present. Be patient. And I came up with an idea where I could take you guys on a tour without actually getting dirty. We'll just look at history from the sidelines. I'll drive, you guys can watch. Just keep your arms and legs inside. There are some dangerous exhibits. All right, here we go. Our first movie set is lovely Paris, about 450 years ago, 1572. Remember those rubber bullets and paint guns? Well, the old-timers did not bother with niceties. Catholic Queen Catherine was pissed off that her sister married a Protestant, a Huguenot, or Huguenot in English. The Catholics were the haves, but the Protestants were getting close to getting some, so Catherine decided to put a stop to it. She ordered Catholic mobs to surprise the sleeping Huguenots in their homes and on the streets. It was called St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and it ended up killing nearly 30,000 all across France. Now that's a government crackdown. Now these were all white people. The few Africans around were servants. Realizing they had to run if they wanted to keep their heads on, French Huguenots hightailed it to faraway parts all over Europe, everywhere except France. I only mention this nasty part of history because 2 of those refugee Huguenot families were early versions of the Peachins, called Pachins, probably cowardly like me, but at least they were smart enough to get out of town. The other refugee family of note was a family who lived on one of the Paris bridges, the Duponts. Okay, let's move the tram on to, say, 200 years later. The next movie set is a bustling little town in the British colony of Pennsylvania called Philadelphia, say 1740. The descendants of the Pachins, apparently deciding they could stand each other and family arguments in close quarters, crossed the Atlantic in a small ship for the New World. It was a rough crossing. People got sick. Some died. Meanwhile, Africans apparently could only get tickets on ships with very tight steerage, and the ships were often delayed by passengers wanting to get off, sometimes in the middle of the Atlantic. Many, many people died. The Pichins found a land of opportunity. This is Elfreth's Alley, a tourist spot and residential street that calls itself the longest continuously inhabited city street in the nation. It's still occupied. Different branches of the hard-working Pichin family, I can vouch for that, Gene, owned 3 houses on this street. And some of the Pichins must have become prominent because a 2.5-mile-long street in another working-class neighborhood bears the family name, anglicized to Pichin, since, after all, this was a British colony and the Brits thought that sounded more English. The Pichins took advantage of opportunities. On the other hand, opportunities for the Africans were more limited. Shortly after they arrived, the Pichins found themselves looking down the musket barrel of yet another conflict, the American Revolution. Now, which side to root for? Maybe they just flipped a French franc. But the evidence shows they were patriots. A backbone. Christopher Pichin, born in 1747, subsidized a regiment in the Continental Army, and along with other colony settlers, became an American. This grave, nestled among other patriots, is 1 block away from the Liberty Bell. Meanwhile, some 9,000 Africans fought in the Continental Army against the British. But 20,000 Africans, offered a chance to be free, joined the British. Either way you look at it, just as it does today, military service provided opportunity for work. Okay, the next stop on our tram will be only 30 miles away from Philly in tiny Delaware. 40 years after the Pichins became patriots, 1802. This is the beautiful Brandywine River, which ran a mile away from my boyhood home. Remember that other refugee family, the DuPonts? They had the brains and the business acumen the Pichins lacked. After watching all the armies shoot at each other, E.I. DuPont opened up a gunpowder factory on the banks of the Brandywine. He used no slaves. But it was not a picnic working there. This is the back of one of the mills. 3 stone walls, sides and rear, but only 1 wooden wall on the other side, the front. When one of the many accidental explosions occurred, the dead workers were blown through the front wall into the Brandywine, where they floated away. The demand for gunpowder was so great, DuPont got extremely rich. Although the DuPonts had none, tiny Delaware now had about 5,000 slaves. Nearby Maryland and Virginia had a combined total of 500,000 slaves. This regional concentration was to play a role in a future decision by Abraham Lincoln that I never learned about in my Delaware school. Now, let's take the tram from DuPont's Wilmington, 75 miles southwest, to another set, Baltimore, Maryland. The new America was back using DuPont black powder to defend itself against the British in the War of 1812. Now Africans could be found in equal numbers, fighting for both sides, anything to go free and advance their own cause. One of the white officers of the Maryland militia was Baltimorean William Pichin. The Brits had already burned the White House, and it all came to a head in 1814 when the British decided to crush the Americans by bombarding Fort McHenry from the sea. And we all know what happened there. The Star-Spangled Banner was still flying in the morning. The British turned tail and left. A lawyer who had witnessed everything wrote a poem about the battle. Turns out William Pichin was also the publisher of the Baltimore Patriot. The lawyer asked him to publish the poem. He did, and it was later set to music as the Star-Spangled Banner. I'm proud of the Peachin heritage, and to this day, regardless how other people feel, I will always stand and salute just as I did in the Air Force, because I believe America is still growing into its constitutional promises. But the white government had no love for the former slaves who turned coat, and the Francis Scott Key language of the third stanza tells the story of the prevailing thinking of the time. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. 1860. This set is Richmond, Virginia. It was the capital of the Confederacy, located in the state with the most slaves in the nation, nearly 500,000. And it wanted to keep its slaves, so the Civil War began. During the fighting, DuPont lost money when the Confederacy stole his gunpowder from government arsenals in the South, but he got richer when the Union Army paid for even more of it. As we know, in the middle of all this bloodshed, Abraham Lincoln decided it was time to make the USA live up to the words, "All men are created equal." So he invoked the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves free, North and South. The Union Army suddenly welcomed thousands of black soldiers into their ranks. But the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to enslaved people in the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, states which had not joined the Confederacy but were leaning that way. Lincoln exempted the border states because he did not want to lose them. So, the state I grew up in, Delaware, got a pass. The state my father grew up in, Maryland, got a pass. And the university that Dad attended, Virginia, had several secret societies whose bylaws were nearly a carbon copy of the language of the KKK. At the end of the war that killed 600,000 Americans, the Confederate prisoners were glad to be alive, but freed slaves did not fare so well. The DuPonts got even richer, but they had a major problem: PR. How do you advertise in polite society when what you mostly do is sell stuff that kills people? But their business acumen opened up new doors. They diversified and went into a variety of chemical productions in factories all over the world. Nylon, Teflon, Kevlar, and got so rich they ended up investing in and running other companies. Pierre DuPont became the CEO of General Motors. In fact, they got so powerful they created a subculture in Delaware. De facto, the DuPonts owned Delaware. If you lived there, you always paid homage to the DuPont family and company. There were mansions that matched Southern plantations and social standards that were like royalty. But as many of you know, DuPont's success brought scandals as well, and DuPont needed a good pitchman to improve the DuPont brand. And here's where the Peachins and DuPonts merged. My dad, Ed Peachin, consummate pitchman, became the director of advertising for DuPont. He made it sound like every product was a gift to humanity. Talk about your bubbles. The NBA has nothing on Delaware in the 50s and 60s. I'll steal a name from the Kennedys. It was Camelot. That also meant the Peachins were part of this Camelot bubble, where inhabitants rarely socialized outside the invitation list. Decades of debutante parties and circus-sized tents with 40-piece orchestras, receiving lines, and vigilant parents who watched out for the chastity of their heiresses. At home, there were black nannies and cooks and servants who took the bus from the downtown ghettos and exactly fit the mold of the movie The Help. My prep school, built by the DuPonts so that their children could avoid public school, was all white and very small. But at the very same time in history, outside my bubble, 9 black students were spat upon trying to integrate Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. Eisenhower had to send in the National Guard to get them into the building. If I even read about it, I thought, that's really far away. But only 30 miles away from my house, the champion Philadelphia Phillies were owned by a member of the DuPont family. In 1947, Jackie Robinson signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers and also got spat upon. The Phillies, on the other hand, threatened to boycott any games where the opponent had a Negro teammate. You hear that, Mookie? Let's move ahead to 1962. Let's stop here at this fraternity house at Bucknell University, Pennsylvania. When I arrived as a freshman, the entire student body was white, except for one man, a junior named Richard Body, a star athlete, musician, and honors student from Rochester, New York. 2 years before, the Brotherhood pledged Body and was immediately kicked out of the national charter. When the National Muckety Mucks sent an enforcer to visit this local to get it back on track, the brothers sent him to be Body's roommate for the night. Body charmed the uptight out of him. A year later, the fraternity was reinstated. In a change of life for me, I joined this house that turned out to be the best house on campus. Body, who later ran for president of the U.S. as a libertarian and has lived in Huntington Beach for 40 years, recently threw himself an 80th birthday where he said, "I may be in the final quarter of the game of life, or, without knowing it, overtime. But I love the game, and all of you." Suddenly, the world, or at least the U.S., was changing, so let's drive the tram into this soundstage and see a slideshow. 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Looked like Brotherhood was gaining momentum. But then that was snuffed out 3 years later in 1968. Then that same year, another voice was heard, Muhammad Ali. Stripped of his championship belt and threatened with jail, he said he was not going to be another black man fighting in a white man's misguided war. He was not jailed, did not go to Nam, but also was barred from boxing for 5 years, the years of his prime. 4 years later, in 1972, 14-year veteran Curt Flood sued Major League Baseball over free agency, stating a team could not own him like cattle and trade him at their whim. He had to be allowed to find his own worth on the market. He was kicked out of baseball and went bankrupt. 1 step forward, 1 step back. Now let's head to the beautiful city of Chicago, 3 years later in 1975. I lived here for 7 great years working for a TV station and as an NFL Films cameraman. In a city often thought of as at least 2 parts, I lived in the north, mostly white section. Now you've heard of South Chicago. For years it has been a neighborhood where black people kill black people. A neighborhood similar to one in Minneapolis where desperate men like George Floyd find themselves stealing to survive. Where in 2020, Southside violence has peaked. Let's go back to 1975. On a nearly empty holiday Eastern Airline flight, yes, there were those before COVID, after covering a college game, I met a perky stewardess, not a flight attendant, Clora Ann Williams. We decided to go on a date. Clora Ann Williams, black, lived in South Chicago. I picked her up at her mother's house. Her mother was surprised. So was I. From memory, I have drawn my view of the living room as I walked in. 6 beds, individually rented out to customers for the night, the week, whatever. Mrs. Williams, income. In the back was Clara's room, decorated to represent dreams of her future, a future outside the neighborhood she was trying to escape. Clara was smart, ambitious, and talented. She not only made money as a stewardess, she had a musical contract, and she was a Chicago Honey Bear, the cheerleading group for the NFL Chicago Bears. George Halas got rid of them in 1986, saying cheesecake had nothing to do with his Manly football team, but they served as a stepping stone for ambitious Clora. Clora and I lived together in my near-north white neighborhood for about a year, but it was impossible for her to escape the reality of her hood. One day on my car radio, a report described a rape and murder in her neighborhood. The victim turned out to be her cousin. When we eventually parted ways, Clora wanted to live in my neighborhood, but the apartment landlord would not take her money. So I put 3 months' rent on my credit card. That section is now diverse. Things change slowly. 2 years later, in 1977, I was assigned a film crew to go into Arkansas to revisit Little Rock Central High desegregation, now 20 years later. The student population had become 50-50 black-white. But when I wanted to recreate a recurring nightmare that the black student body president had, being shouted at as he fell over hurdles in the hallway, my crew was kicked out of town. But we came back, used a credit card, and broke into the building at night and filmed the scene. The film won a Peabody. But now, in 2020, after white flight, the school that was all white is largely black. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But things do change. Some steps forward are stopped, then started again. 1 year after he died penniless in 1997, Curt Flood's name was attached to the Curt Flood Rule, which created free agency and set the stage for Mookie Betts to become rich. 2020. Now my Delaware prep school is diverse. The alumni chairman is black, and the school thrives without DuPont money. So we've made steps forward and steps back, but one situation persists, seemingly unable to change. The story of the haves and the have-nots continues. Mookie and other people in my neighborhood on one end, and a whole lot of George Floyds on the other. Regardless of your views of the demonstrations, here are some facts. The black wealth gap, bad for decades, is worse now. African Americans whose households are headed by college graduates have less worth than white households headed by high school dropouts. Fewer than half of all African American adults now have a job. The George Floyds of the world do not feel, and indeed are not marriage material. The COVID-19 virus is hitting these people harder. Wealth begets wealth through generations, and African Americans have missed out on that transfer for centuries. A recent New York Times article revealed all the redlining in the city of Richmond since 1930. Redlining keeps down neighborhoods like George Floyd's, preventing access to banks, schools, voting, and real estate. George Floyd lived inside those red lines, and so did Clora Ann Williams and her mother. But now, Richmond has a woman who is at the helm of change, a city planner, Maritza Peachin, my daughter-in-law, Harvard-educated and trying to change things. So our studio tour comes to an end. Thank you for staying seated. I close with a view of the present day. Mookie Betts moved into my neighborhood. My next-door neighbor's middle school baseball player with a batting cage in his backyard wrote Mookie a note asking him to sign a rookie card. Next day, Mookie arrived with an autographed card and ball and gave Nate some hitting tips. Yes, Mookie moved into the hood, and nobody moved out. Go Dodgers. Thank you, gentlemen.